Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a video on recommending you books if you like themes around oppression and revolution. This is going to be part one. I will do a second video on this and maybe even a third video because this is a pretty common theme, I think, in a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. But these are the ones that I personally recommend. And with that in mind, let's jump into the video. The first recommendation that I'm going to give you is an oldie but a goodie. And I think it's a series that I actually would really like to reread now that I'm a bit more experienced in my fantasy reading. And that is Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. This series is so good. It's a trilogy and we're essentially following our main character Vin as she basically bands together with a bunch of other people to throw down the system. And this is a classic tale of there's people at the bottom of the totem pole who are being oppressed and there's people at the top doing the oppressing. One of the things I really like about this book is that the villain has already won in this book. So there is no kind of constant battle. Like the state of the world is that the bad, evil person is already at the top of society and that there are people now they're trying to resist that. And I think one of the things that Brandon Sanderson did a pretty decent job of representing the struggle of the Scar, which the Scar are essentially the lower class in society, and differentiating that really well between the kind of upper echelons of society. I think it's the second book we get a lot more exposure to kind of like the gentry, or essentially what is the equivalent of like the gentry, like the lords, the people who run like the political houses. And it's really great to kind of see that system within itself, because I think a lot of times when we see books about like oppression and division and like we have the people at the top and the people at the bottom, is we almost always get the view of the bottom and the people who are being oppressed, but we rarely actually see what is happening at the top of that society, like what's happening with the top 1%. And we get a direct insight into what these people are doing and also whether all of these people believe in that system and whether it should be run in that way. And often there are actually people who are against that, but they are powerless potentially to change that system from the inside because of the fact that the majority of the people like being in that top 1%. I think it's a really well written series. Again, I'm basing that on when I read it like 5 years ago, and I've read a lot more fantasy since then. And I've talked about before that Brandon Sanderson is an author that I don't really intend to read anytime soon, just because I find his books to be quite frustrating sometimes. But I remember at the time that I was reading this, I blitzed through these books so quickly. They were so addictive. And I think it's just because that exploration around the oppression and then the seeing kind of the seeds of revolution and then that revolution sparking into something that becomes its own thing, I think is quite well done. And I'll have to kind of reread it at some point and see whether that still stands the test of time. But like I said, when I read it, I really enjoyed it. And I think it does a pretty good job of showing both sides of the table as well. The next one I'm going to recommend to you is one of my favorite series of all time. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And that's the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, but also the broader First Law world. I think there's some really interesting exploration around class in these books. This is a multi-POV story. We have certain characters who are kind of very much at the kind of bottom of society, but then we also have, you know, a character like Jezal who is kind of at the top of his game, and he's a part of circles that many people would find very difficult to get in. And we see how power can corrupt and how these systems often need to be completely broken down in order for them to be rebuilt again in a way that benefits the majority rather than that top 1%. I would say the second trilogy that Abercrombie did, which is the Age of Madness trilogy, definitely goes into that a lot more. Much more, I would argue, than First Law. But I think we see the kind of seed of that, and I would say even more than the seed of that in the initial trilogy, but that just gets built on and built on as the series progresses. I think if you're looking for something that's maybe a bit more nuanced and we see it kind of graduate over time, then I think start with First Law, then read the 3 standalones, and then read that Age of Madness trilogy where it really kind of comes to the boiling point. The next one I'm going to recommend is a book that I read recently. I've only read the first book, but I think I can confidently say that this book and this duology really tackles with the themes of oppression and revolution, and that is The Empty Throne duology by Daniel Plansky. I read the first book, and this is very much a split society. We have the kind of top 1% who are essentially like walking gods, and they have all the privileges in life and they have freedom to do whatever they want. They dictate the laws and they dictate kind of what is happening in the world. And then we have the people at the bottom who are, you know, doing the menial tasks and live in squalor and live in kind of slums, and you know, they live lives that are not easy lives. They're very hard lives that require graft and not questioning the system. And what we see in this book, and it's a slow start, but what we see in this book is the kind of setting up of these systems and why they are the way that they are. And then as the book progresses, and what I suspect we'll see in book 2 is the questioning of these systems, but also the breaking down of these systems to rebuild them from the ground up so that they benefit, again, the majority rather than the minority at the top. I think there's some really interesting character studies in this book that really show the inner workings of how these people think and justify what they do. It's quite sick, actually, like how they justify killing people just so that they can get an extra buck, or just so that they can increase their power by 0.01%. Like, it's cruel. Like, this world is a very cruel world, and we see our characters suffer in that world as a direct result of the actions of the people at the top of the pyramid. Very good book in terms of the way that it realizes that struggle for people who are at the bottom, but also realizes the constant quest for more for the people who are at the top. Very good in that regard. The next one, and the penultimate one that I'm going to recommend, is The Will of the Many by James Islington. The first book is out. I believe it's going to be a trilogy. I think this has really great exploration around class and kind of power and how that's distributed across the society. So the magic system is based on will, and I think like the majority of people have will, and the people who are at the bottom of the totem pole have to give their will to the people at the top of the totem pole so that they can get more power, basically, and have more magic. The people who have will and who control will basically like control systems, government, the way things are built, the way things are done. By giving up your will, you're giving up that power that you have to people so that they can then realize that power for themselves. And even though we haven't seen tons of exploration around like revolution yet, we're starting to see people question the systems. There is like a revolutionary group that is trying to wake people up to what is happening to them, and we see kind of some of that come through throughout the book. But I'm really excited to see how that continues to develop in the next 2 books, because I think it's naturally going to hit a crescendo, and then we're going to have to see these characters build the world up from the scratch again so that it's more fair and has a more kind of egalitarian approach. This is a really, really good book. Like, I think it's really well paced. I think it's one of those books that is just like constantly got lots of action, and you can see that something is going to have to change in the society in order for it to be a fairer place for everybody involved. And we're just starting to see the beginning of that. The last one I'm going to recommend to you is debut fantasy book, and I did a dedicated review on it. I think it's so good, and that is Kavitri by Aman J. Bedi. This is apparently going to be a trilogy. This is the first book. You can read it though without worrying about any massive cliffhangers. This is a society based kind of on India, so very much a kind of caste system is in place. We very much have people who, again, are at the top of the totem pole, who are controlling everything and making the decisions, and then we have the people at the bottom who, again, are doing menial labor and they don't have the ability to kind of rise up. Our main character, she also comes from a people that have been oppressed more so than anybody else over a period of time, because they have magic and they have a very specific type of magic that could make them very powerful. The ruling elite are constantly trying to keep them down and are preventing them from having rights, basic rights, and preventing them from being able to do anything that could even somewhat allow them to have some sort of power. Like, no matter how small that power is, they just don't want them to have any of it because they are very powerful individuals. So we do again have this kind of very classic setup of a downtrodden people who have been oppressed over time. They're kind of at wit's end and something needs to change. What we're seeing at the beginning of this book is the spark of revolution, the spark of people wanting to no longer be a part of a system that oppresses them. I think what we're going to see in the next 2 books is going to be really interesting, because our main character who's becoming more of a leader, and we're seeing her develop her own powers but also her own confidence. And I'm really, really excited to see kind of how the political landscape also shifts, because we've only really seen one perspective, which is the perspective of the downtrodden. I really hope that we get to see the perspective of the people who are at the top, because I think it gives a more 360 view. But even if we don't, like, I think this is a really great example because it's set and based on a place where there is a lot of problems with class. I mean, they literally have a caste system, so people are divided by their class, and it's still very much a problem of today. So I think with that in mind, like, it has some actual real world context kind of related to it, and it makes it feel a little bit more grounded in reality, even though it is a fantasy book. This is a really good one in general, but I think if you're looking for a slightly different perspective, given the world building and given kind of what it's based on, then I think you should definitely give this one a go. So there we have it. Those are 5 recommendations to read if you like books that have themes around like oppression and revolution, people kind of sticking it to the man. I will do another part of this for sure. I think there'll probably be another 2 or 3 parts to this, to be honest, because it's such a big theme as it relates to fantasy and sci-fi, and I think there's a lot of it, and I don't think all of it is good, but I think the 5 that I've recommended today are like really solid, and I think there's another 15-20 books that I want to recommend that are also really solid. Let me know if there's any books or series that you would recommend down below as it relates to this specific theme, and I will see you there. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye.